Dust doesn't settle in Bitter Creek. It just coats a different kind of desperation. $300. That was the price of a good team of mules or a decent plot of timber up the ridge. It wasn't supposed to be the price of a woman and her 5 starving children. Amos didn't want a family. He wanted to be left alone. But when the gavel fell, the mountain man had just bought a mother of 5. What she did next shook the whole West. Sweat stung Amos's eyes, mixing with the grit of a town he despised. Bitter Creek was a sore on the edge of the frontier, a place where men came to lose whatever morals they hadn't already left out on the plains. He shifted the weight of his pack. 6 months of trapping up in the high country skinning beaver and dodging early blizzards all traded away for coffee salt powder and the heavy leather pouch of gold eagles now pulling at his belt. He intended to walk straight to the livery fetch his pack mule and leave. Shouts from the square dragged his attention toward the mercantile. A crowd had gathered thick and loud smelling of stale whiskey and unwashed wool. Amos tried to ignore it. Trouble in town was town trouble. He was a mountain man. His concerns ended where the tree line began. A child's scream cut through the low rumble of the mob. It wasn't a playful shriek. It was raw, ragged terror. Amos stopped. His jaw tightened under a thick, graying beard. He turned on his heel, his worn boots kicking up small clouds of alkali dust, and pushed his way through the outer ring of onlookers. Men moved aside when they felt the sheer density of him, a broad-shouldered ghost in buckskin and bare fur. In the center of the square stood a wooden loading block. On it was a woman. Her calico dress was faded to the color of dirty dishwater patched at the elbows and hem. Her face was hollowed out by hunger skin pulled tight over high cheekbones, but her eyes were a fierce, burning brown. She stood with her chin raised. Clinging to her skirts were 4 children. A girl of maybe 7 twin boys, no older than 5, and a toddler. In the woman's arms rested a bundle of rags that moved with the faint, jerky motions of an infant. Standing beside the block was Hiram Cobb, the town's primary creditor and saloon keep. Cobb was a man who sweated grease and spoke in ledgers. The late Mr. Miller owed me $300. Cobb announced, his voice carrying over the muttering crowd. Since he saw fit to catch a fever and die before paying his tab, the debt falls to the estate. Cobb gestured lazily toward the woman. This is the estate, gentlemen. Amos watched the woman. She didn't flinch. Her hands gripped her older daughter's shoulder with a white-knuckled intensity. Now. Cobb continued pulling a cigar from his vest. I ain't a cruel man. I've got a buyer for the boys down at the copper mine in Sonora. They're young, but they can fit in the narrow shafts. The girl can work the kitchens at my place. As for the widow, he smiled, a wet, ugly thing. She can work off the rest of the debt upstairs. The crowd chuckled. A few men shifted uncomfortably, but nobody spoke up. The law out here was a piece of paper nailed to a post 300 miles away. Debt was God. Amos felt a cold, familiar knot tighten in his gut. He didn't want this. He had winter preparations to make. He had solitude waiting for him in a cabin built of rough-hewn pine tucked beneath the shadow of a glacier. 6 mouths to feed was a death sentence in the deep snow. Cobb reached out to grab one of the twin boys. The boy wailed, shrinking back. The widow Hannah was her name. Amos thought he heard someone whisper, slapped Cobb's hand away with the speed of a striking viper. "Don't touch him," she hissed. Her voice was raspy, dry as dead leaves. Cobb's face flushed purple. He raised a heavy hand. Amos moved before he consciously made the decision. He stepped out of the crowd, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden boards of the platform. He didn't say a word. He simply unhooked the leather pouch from his belt and dropped it onto the top of a flour barrel next to Cobb. The heavy clank of solid gold hitting wood silenced the square. Cobb stared at the pouch, then up at the mountain man. "What's this ridge?" 300. Amos grunted. His voice was like grinding stones rusty from months of disuse. Cobb frowned, his greed warring with his confusion. He untied the strings, peering inside at the gleam of minted eagles. "You buying the debt?" "I'm buying them." Amos looked at the woman. She stared back. There was no relief in her brown eyes, only a new, terrifying calculation. She had just been traded from a known monster to an unknown beast. "All of them?" Cobb asked, incredulous. "What the hell is a trapper going to do with a litter of brats?" Amos leveled a gaze at Cobb that made the saloon keeper take a half-step backward. "Count it. Keep the change." Amos turned to the woman. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't offer a kind smile. He looked at the meager pile of belongings at her feet, a single burlap sack and a worn woolen blanket. "Pick up your things," Amos said. Hannah hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then she shifted the infant to her left hip, bent down in one fluid motion, and grabbed the sack. She looked at her children. "Walk," she commanded them. Not a plea. An order. Amos stepped down from the block and began to push his way back through the stunned crowd. He didn't look back to see if they were following. He could hear the scuffing of small, bare feet in the dirt and the heavy, measured tread of the mother. He had just spent his entire winter's stake. He had just bought 6 lives. As they cleared the edge of the mob, the reality of the transaction settled over Amos like a suffocating blanket. He was a solitary creature, adapted to silence and brutality. He had no idea how to keep a family alive. Shadows stretched long and purple across the foothills by the time Bitter Creek disappeared from view. The trail was nothing more than a rutted scar, winding upward through sagebrush and loose scree. Amos walked point, leading a battered grey pack mule loaded with flour beans and whatever winter gear his remaining pocket change had managed to secure. Behind him, the silence was absolute. Amos was accustomed to the quiet of the mountains, but this was a different breed of silence. It was taut. It was the silence of prey, trying not to draw the attention of a predator. He glanced back over his shoulder. Hannah walked exactly 10 paces behind the mule. She carried the infant a boy who hadn't made a sound since the town square. Beside her, the 7-year-old girl carrying the burlap sack held the hand of one twin. Hannah held the other. They were moving at a brutal pace, the incline steep, and the air growing thinner, but none of them asked to stop. The twins were stumbling. Their small legs trembled with every step over the loose rocks. Amos sighed a slow exhalation through his nose. He stopped the mule. Hannah immediately stopped. She pulled the children close to her skirts, her eyes locked on Amos's hands, watching for any sudden movements. She was expecting a strike, a yell, a demand. Amos walked back to the group. He didn't look at Hannah. He looked at the twins. "What are their names?" he asked. Hannah swallowed hard. "Levi, Jacob. The girl is Mary. The baby is Seth." Amos reached down. Hannah tensed, shifting her weight to put herself between the massive man and her boys. Amos ignored her defensive posture. He hooked one massive hand under Levi's arm, lifting the boy effortlessly, and deposited him on top of the flour sacks tied to the mule. He did the same with Jacob. The boys clung to the ropes, eyes wide with terror, looking at their mother for instruction. "They ride," Amos said, turning his back on them. "We walk." He clicked his tongue, and the mule lurched forward. Amos didn't wait for a thank you. He didn't want one. As the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, the temperature plummeted. Summer in the lowlands meant nothing up here. The wind carried the biting chill of high-altitude snow. Amos found a sheltered outcropping of granite, surrounded by thick stands of lodgepole pine. It was a dry camp, no running water nearby, but it offered protection from the wind. "Camp," he announced, dropping his pack. He expected the mother to collapse. He expected the children to start wailing from the cold, the hunger, the sheer exhaustion of the forced march. He began unbuckling the cinch on the mule, preparing to do all the work himself. Instead, Hannah moved. She set the infant down in the center of the camp, wrapping him tightly in her single woolen blanket. She looked at Mary. "Gather wood, small dry pieces, nothing thicker than your wrist." Hannah instructed. Her voice was low, calm, entirely devoid of panic. Mary nodded and scrambled into the trees without a word of complaint. Hannah approached the mule. She didn't ask permission. She began unknotting the ropes holding the flour and beans, her hands moving with practiced, efficient speed. Amos watched her from the corner of his eye. Her hands were scarred, the knuckles swollen. These were not the hands of a woman who had spent her life being cared for. These were the hands of a worker. Amos stepped in, taking the heavy sacks from her before she could strain her back. He dropped them by the rock wall. "I can cook," Hannah said, breaking the silence. She stood straight, looking him dead in the eye. "If you provide the rations, I will make the meals. The children will pull their weight. They won't be a burden." It was a business proposition. She was establishing her value. She was letting him know she wasn't a victim to be pitied or a pet to be kept. "There's beans," Amos said shortly. "Salt pork in the wax paper. Water in the canteens. Don't use it all. Next creek is 5 miles up." Hannah nodded once. Within 20 minutes, Mary had returned with a respectable pile of kindling. Hannah had a fire going, a small, smokeless Indian fire, built for heat, not for show. She soaked the beans, diced the salt pork with a small, rusted knife she pulled from her boot, and set an iron pot over the coals. Amos sat cross-legged across the fire from them, methodically cleaning his Henry rifle. He watched them through the flickering orange light. The children huddled close to the flames, their faces dirty and gaunt, but they didn't beg for the food. They waited. Hannah tended the pot, her posture rigid. She kept glancing at him, her eyes darting to the rifle, to his knife, to his hands. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She had been bought by a strange man in a lawless land. She was waiting for the price to be exacted. When the food was ready, Hannah portioned it out. She gave the largest scoop to Amos, serving it on a tin plate. She handed it to him without making eye contact. Then she fed the children. Finally, she scraped the bottom of the pot for herself, ending up with little more than broth and a few beans. Amos looked at his overflowing plate. He looked at her near-empty bowl. He didn't say a word. He stood up, walked over to where she sat by the fire, and scraped half of his beans into her bowl. Hannah froze. She looked down at the food, then up at him. Her fierce, guarded expression fractured for a split second, revealing a profound, exhausted confusion. "Eat!" Amos said gruffly, turning his back and walking back to his spot. "Can't have you dying on the trail. Too much work to dig a grave in this rock." It was a harsh thing to say, a cynical cover for a decent act. But as Amos ate his meal in silence, he noticed Hannah's shoulders drop just a fraction of an inch. The wind howled through the pines, a lonely, bitter sound, but inside the small circle of firelight, a fragile, unspoken truce had been struck in the dirt of the Wild West. Granite gave way to dense stands of blue spruce and lodgepole pine as they climbed higher into the thin, biting air. 4 days on the trail stripped away whatever polite illusions might have existed between them. Survival out here was math. Miles walked against daylight left. Calories burned against beans consumed. Amos watched Hannah. He watched her boots' thin leather peeling away from the soles bound together with strips of canvas she'd torn from her own petticoat. She walked with a slight limp, now favoring her left leg, but her pace never slackened. When the twins cried from the altitude, their heads pounding, she didn't offer soft words. She handed them water, told them to breathe through their noses, and ordered them to keep moving. She was hard. She had to be. Bitter Creek would have chewed up a soft woman and spit out the bones. On the afternoon of the 5th day, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. The wind died, replaced by a heavy, pregnant stillness that made the hairs on Amos's arms stand up. He pushed the mule faster. "Storm's coming," he grunted, looking back at the ragged line. "Move." They cleared the final ridge just as the first flakes began to fall. They weren't the fat, lazy flakes of a valley snow. These were sharp, crystalline needles, driven horizontal by a sudden, violent downdraft. Through the squall, the silhouette of Amos's cabin emerged. It was a brutalist structure of notched logs chinked with mud and horsehair tucked against a sheer rock face that protected its northern flank. A heavy stone chimney anchored one end. It wasn't built for comfort. It was built to withstand the crushing weight of 20 feet of snow. Amos unlatched the heavy timber door and pushed it open. The air inside was stale, smelling of cold ash, cured leather, and old trapping bait. It was a bachelor's den, dark and utilitarian. A single bed built into the wall, a cast-iron stove, a rough-hewn table, and walls hung with traps and stretched pelts. He stepped aside. Hannah paused at the threshold. She pulled her worn blanket tighter around the infant, her eyes scanning the dim interior. She was calculating again. Measuring the space, identifying the corners, judging the man by the room he kept. She stepped inside. Mary followed, dragging the twins by the hands. The children huddled together in the center of the dirt floor, shivering their eyes wide as they took in the dead, cold room. Firewood stacked against the far wall. Amos said, stepping past them to unload the mule before it froze to death in the yard. "Matches are in the tin on the table." When he returned 10 minutes later, dragging the heavy sacks of flour and beans the cabin had changed, the stove was roaring, radiating a fierce metallic heat. But that wasn't the shift. The shift was in the air. Hannah had stripped the dusty canvas tarp from the bed and was shaking it out. She had ordered Mary to sweep the packed dirt floor with a pine bough. The children's meager belongings were neatly stacked in the corner furthest from the door, a designated perimeter. She was claiming the space. Not through ownership, but through labor. Amos dropped the sacks with a heavy thud. "That's my bed." Hannah didn't flinch. She folded the canvas into a tight square and placed it on the mattress of dry pine needles. "The children need to be off the floor. The damp will settle in their lungs." She turned to face him. "I'll sleep on the floor with them, but they need the mattress." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of biological necessity. Amos stared at her. Her face was smudged with soot, her lips cracked and bleeding from the wind. She looked terrifyingly fragile, yet immovably stubborn. He could easily force the issue. He was twice her size. It was his cabin, his rules. He walked over to the corner, grabbed a thick stack of cured buffalo robes he traded from the Ute last spring, and threw them onto the dirt floor near the stove. "I sleep by the fire," Amos rumbled, turning away from her stunned expression. "Keeps my joints from locking up. Put the brats in the bed." He didn't wait to see her reaction. He took his rifle and a rag and sat at the table, beginning the meticulous process of oiling the barrel. For the next 3 days, the storm battered the cabin. The wind screamed through the valley, piling snowdrifts as high as the windows. Inside, a tight claustrophobic choreography developed. 6 bodies in a space meant for one required a silent dance to avoid collisions. Amos expected chaos. He expected whining. Instead, he got industry. Hannah ran the cabin like a general. Mary was tasked with keeping the wood box full from the indoor stack. The twins were given scraps of leather to polish with ash, a pointless task designed purely to keep them occupied and quiet. Hannah herself mended. She took Amos's torn winter coat, a heavy canvas duster he had meant to patch for 2 years, and fixed it with small, brutally efficient stitches. She was paying her rent, working off the $300 day by day, stitch by stitch. Amos found himself watching her hands in the firelight. They never stopped moving. Even when she sat staring into the flames, her fingers were busy twisting scraps of string or smoothing the baby's fine hair. He realized with a slow, creeping discomfort that he had brought a wild thing into his home. Not wild like a wolf, but wild like a river, constant, relentless, and impossible to tame. Frost crept up the single glass pane of the cabin window, growing thicker with each passing week. December hit the high country like a hammer. The world outside the heavy timber door ceased to exist, replaced by a blinding, howling expanse of white. Inside the routine was ground into the dirt floor. Amos hunted when the weather broke, bringing back stringy hair or the occasional ptarmigan. Hannah cooked, cleaned, and stretched the rations with a terrifying ingenuity. Pine nuts were ground into flour. Bone marrow was boiled into broth until the water ran clear. They spoke only when necessary. More wood. Salt is low. Snow's drifted over the chimney I'm going up. It was a survival pact, stripped of all pleasantries. Yet beneath the icy silence a strange rhythm had formed. Amos no longer felt the urge to leave. When he was out checking his trap lines, dragging his snowshoes through powder that reached his thighs, he found himself thinking of the heat of the stove. He found himself thinking of the smell of roasting chicory root that Hannah used to fake coffee. The truce broke in the dead of January. It started with a whimper. Seth the infant had been quiet for days. Too quiet. Amos woke in the dark. The fire burned down to glowing embers, to the sound of ragged, wet breathing. He sat up, throwing off his heavy buffalo robes. Across the room, Hannah was already awake. She was rocking in the corner, clutching the baby to her chest. In the dim, red glow of the coals, Amos saw the sheer panic stripping away her iron mask. "What's wrong?" Amos asked, his voice rough with sleep. "He's burning up!" Hannah whispered. Her voice cracked. It was the first time he had heard fear in her tone since Bitter Creek. "His chest is rattling." Amos kicked out of his bedding and strode across the floor. He knelt beside her and pressed the back of his massive, calloused hand against the infant's forehead. The heat radiating from the tiny body was shocking. Seth was gasping, his small chest heaving violently, fighting for every sliver of air. "Put him on the table," Amos ordered. "No." Hannah pulled the boy tighter. "It's too cold." "Do it, Hannah." He used her name for the first time. It hung in the air, heavy and sudden. "If you want him to breathe, put him on the table." She looked into his eyes. She saw no cruelty there, only the cold, hard pragmatism of a man who dealt with death every day. Slowly, her arms trembling, she unspooled her grip and laid the baby on the rough planks of the table. Amos didn't hesitate. He walked to the storage shelves, rummaging through a wooden crate filled with jars and dried bundles. He pulled out a fistful of dried white willow bark and a crumbling bunch of dried mint. "Mary!" Amos barked. The 7-year-old girl peeked her head over the edge of the bed, her eyes wide. "Get snow from the bucket. Put it in the kettle. Stomp the fire up." Mary scrambled out of bed, moving with the same desperate speed as her mother. Amos took his hunting knife and began shaving the willow bark into a tin cup. "He's too young," Hannah said, hovering over the table, her hands hovering inches from the baby, afraid to touch him. "His body can't take the fever. He hasn't eaten enough since—" She trailed off, swallowing the bitter reality of their starvation in the valley. "Willows bring down the fire," Amos muttered, dumping the shavings into the boiling water Mary brought over. "Mint opens the lungs. We breathe the steam into him." For the next 10 hours, the cabin became an infirmary. Amos showed Hannah how to make a tent over the table, using a canvas tarp trapping the steam from the kettle. They took turns holding the struggling infant over the vapors. When the baby refused to drink the bitter willow tea, Amos dipped a scrap of clean linen into the brew and squeezed drops directly onto Seth's tongue. Hannah didn't sleep. She sat rigidly by the table, chanting a low, rhythmic hum that sounded like a hymn stripped of its words. Amos sat on the floor nearby, feeding the stove, watching the shadows dance across her exhausted face. He saw the dark circles bruising her eyes. He saw the sheer force of will keeping her upright. She was fighting a war against a microscopic enemy, and she was doing it with empty hands. Sometime near dawn, the frantic wet rattling in the baby's chest began to slow. The terrifying heat radiating from his skin broke, leaving him drenched in a cold sweat. Seth took a long, deep breath and fell into a natural sleep. Hannah slumped forward, resting her forehead against the edge of the table. Her shoulders began to shake. She made no sound, but Amos could see the violent tremors of repressed terror finally escaping her body. Amos stood up. He walked over to the stove, poured a tin cup of the hot chicory water, and carried it back. He set it on the table near her hand. Hannah slowly raised her head. Tears had cut clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks. She looked at the cup, then up at the giant mountain man standing over her. "Why?" She croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "In town, you could have walked away. You didn't need this. You didn't need us." Amos looked at the sleeping baby, then at her. He didn't have poetry in him. He didn't have grand speeches about redemption or morality. He only knew the brutal arithmetic of the wild. "Ain't right for a strong thing to be crushed by weak men," Amos said simply. "Drink your root water. You've got chores tomorrow." He turned and walked back to his buffalo robes, pulling them over his shoulders. He closed his eyes, listening to the steady, even breathing of the infant and the soft clink of the tin cup against Hannah's teeth. The winter was far from over, but the ice inside the cabin had finally cracked. February brought a cold that didn't just chill the skin. It ached in the bones. The Ute called it the starving moon, and the name fit. The wind stripped the snow from the high peaks, blowing it into drifts that buried the cabin up to the eaves. Inside, the world had shrunk to a 10-by-10 box of dim light and stale air. The rations were gone. The beans had run out a week after the baby's fever broke. The flour sack was nothing but a flour-dusted memory shaken clean and boiled to make a thin, cloudy gruel. They were surviving on the stringy meat of snowshoe hares, and there simply wasn't enough fat on the animals to keep 6 furnaces burning. Amos felt the hunger gnawing at his ribs. He saw it hollowing out the children's faces. Mary had stopped asking questions. The twins, Levi and Jacob, sat listlessly by the stove, too exhausted to squabble. Hannah gave them her portions. Amos caught her doing it, slipping her meager share of rabbit meat onto the boys' tin plates when she thought he wasn't looking. He didn't reprimand her. He just started leaving half of his own plate untouched, claiming his stomach was sour from the chicory root. It was a lie. They both knew it. She ate his leavings in silence, her eyes burning with a complicated mix of shame and desperate gratitude. On the morning of the 14th day of the deep freeze, Amos stood up from the table and took his heavy canvas coat from the peg. He strapped on his snowshoes, checked the action on his Henry rifle, and packed an extra handful of cartridges into his pocket. "Where are you going?" Hannah asked. Her voice was flat, trying to hide the spike of panic. "Games moved down to the timberline." Amos grunted, not looking at her. "Hares ain't enough. Need fat. I'm tracking elk. In this wind you'll freeze." Amos pulled a thick woolen cap down over his ears. "Firewood stacked inside. Keep the stove damped down so it burns slow. Don't open the door unless you hear my voice." He didn't wait for an argument. He pushed out into the whiteout, the heavy door slamming shut behind him, cutting off the warmth. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The air was so brittle it hurt to breathe. Amos pushed into the wind, his head down, scanning the tree line for the deep plunging tracks of an elk herd. The hours blurred into a monotonous agony of lifting one heavy snowshoe after another. Frost formed on his beard, freezing his breath into a solid block of ice against his face. By mid-afternoon he found them. A small group of cows huddled in a thicket of blue spruce, chewing on bitter bark. Imus dropped to his stomach in the powder. He dragged himself forward, ignoring the snow, melting through his canvas coat and freezing against his skin. He needed a clean shot. If he wounded one and it ran, he didn't have the strength to track it through the deep drifts. He exhaled a long, slow breath, sighted down the cold iron barrel, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was swallowed instantly by the wind. A heavy cow dropped severed at the spine. The rest of the herd scattered into the white. Killing it was the easy part. Quartering it in the freezing wind, his hands numb and bloody, was a race against frostbite. He could only carry one hindquarter and a slab of the ribs. It was 80 pounds of dead weight. He rigged a drag line from his rope, hitched it around his chest, and turned back towards the mountain. Back in the cabin, the silence was deafening. Hannah paced the dirt floor. Every shriek of the wind against the logs sounded like a man dying. She kept the fire burning, watching the woodpile shrink. She looked at the children huddled under the buffalo robes. If Amos didn't come back, they would starve. But as the hours dragged into darkness, the realization hit her with a strange, sickening weight. Her fear wasn't just about the food. She pictured the massive, silent man lying in the snow, his grey eyes staring blankly at the sky. A sharp, physical pain twisted in her chest. He had bought them. He had saved her baby. He had starved himself to feed her children. He was a rough, scarred brute of a man, but he was the first thing in her life that felt like a foundation. Sometime past midnight, a heavy thud shook the door. Hannah grabbed the iron fire poker. She stood frozen. Hannah. It was a raspy, weak croak. She dropped the poker and unbarred the door, throwing her weight against the wind to pull it open. Amos fell into the room, bringing a cloud of snow with him. He was covered in white, his face the color of old wax. He hauled the massive slab of bloody frozen meat over the threshold and collapsed onto the dirt floor. Hannah didn't scream. She didn't panic. She slammed the door shut, barring it against the storm. Then she dropped to her knees beside him. His coat was frozen stiff. She dragged him towards the stove, her hands working frantically at his buckles and buttons. He was barely conscious, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow. She stripped off his boots, revealing toes that were dangerously white. "Mary!" Hannah barked. "Get the bucket. Fill it with snow." For the second time that winter, the cabin became an infirmary, but the patient had changed. Hannah packed Amos's feet and hands in snow, rubbing the slush against his skin to draw the frost out slowly, without destroying the tissue. She wrapped him in every buffalo robe they had. She boiled a chunk of the elk fat, rendering it down into a rich, greasy broth, and spooned it past his cracked lips. Amos drifted in and out of a dark haze. Whenever he opened his eyes, he saw her. She was always there, leaning over him, tending the fire, her brow furrowed in fierce concentration. She wasn't looking at him like a master or a savior. She was looking at him like a man. "You're a stubborn fool, Amos Ridge," she whispered fiercely, pressing a warm rag to his forehead. Amos managed a weak, terrifyingly crooked smile. "Brought the meat." "You did!" she said, her voice cracking. She didn't pull her hand away from his face. "You did." The thaw came in late April. It didn't arrive with gentle breezes and chirping birds. It came with violence. The mountain shed its winter skin in a rush of roaring runoff, turning the world into a treacherous landscape of slush-exposed rock and sucking mud. The ice inside the cabin had melted alongside the snow outside. Amos had lost the tip of his left pinky toe to the frostbite, leaving him with a slight rolling limp, but his strength had returned. The elk meat had put color back into the children's cheeks. The twins now followed Amos around like stray pups, watching him split wood or sharpen his knives. He didn't shoo them away. Occasionally he'd hand Levi a piece of soft pine and a dull knife, showing him how to shave the wood away from his body. Hannah watched them from the doorway, her hands covered in lye soap. She was washing their winter clothes in a wooden tub on the porch, enjoying the strange, unfamiliar sensation of the sun on her face. They had survived. The debt to Hiram Cobb felt like a lifetime ago, a nightmare buried beneath months of snow. Amos was down by the woodpile swinging a heavy splitting maul. The rhythmic thwack of iron hitting wood echoed off the canyon walls. It was a peaceful sound. Then another sound cut through the crisp spring air. Amos stopped mid-swing. He rested the head of the maul on the chopping block and turned his head listening. Hannah paused, her hands submerged in the soapy water. It was the heavy, sloshing sound of hooves fighting through deep mud. Amos looked down the trail. Through the thinning stands of spruce, 3 riders came into view. They were riding heavy-chested geldings, their dusters caked in wet dirt. Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. She recognized the man in the lead. It was Pike, one of Cobb's enforcers from Bitter Creek. He was a rat-faced man with a jagged scar pulling his upper lip into a permanent sneer. Flanking him were 2 hired guns rough men who smelled blood for a living. Cobb hadn't forgotten the $300 in pure gold eagles. He had spent the winter stewing, realizing that a mountain man who could drop that kind of money on a whim likely had a stash hidden up in the rocks. The thaw had opened the road, and Cobb had sent his dogs to collect. Amos didn't run for the cabin. He stood his ground by the woodpile. His Henry rifle was inside, resting on its pegs. All he had was the heavy splitting maul in his hands. The riders pulled up 10 yards from Amos. Their horses blew hard sides, heaving from the brutal climb. Pike leaned over the pommel of his saddle, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice into the mud. He looked at Amos. Then his eyes drifted up to the porch, fixing on Hannah. He smiled that ugly, scarred sneer. "Morning, Ridge," Pike drawled, resting his hand casually near the butt of the revolver on his hip. "Looks like you and the widow made it through the freeze. Boss was right worried about his investment." "Debts paid," Amos said. His voice was a low rumble, carrying over the sound of the rushing creek. "Well, now see, Mr. Cobb got to checking his ledgers," Pike said, sitting up straight. The 2 men beside him shifted, dropping their hands to their belts. "Turns out there was interest, late fees. It's a complicated math, Ridge. Bottom line is you owe him another $300, or we take the woman and the brats back, plus whatever gold you got buried under this mud to pay for the inconvenience." It was a shakedown, simple, brazen, and backed by iron. Amos tightened his grip on the handle of the maul. He was fast, but he wasn't faster than 3 drawn guns. If he swung, he was a dead man. If he surrendered, they would tear the cabin apart, take the gold, and take Hannah. "You ain't stepping foot in my cabin," Amos said, planting his boots in the mud. Pike chuckled. He drew his revolver in one fluid motion, cocking the hammer back with his thumb. He pointed it directly at Amos's broad chest. "Ain't asking, mountain man. Drop the axe." Amos didn't move. He stared down the barrel of the gun, calculating the distance, wondering if he could crush Pike's skull before the other 2 fired. On the porch, Hannah's hands came out of the soapy water. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. The terrified, starving widow on the auction block in Bitter Creek was dead buried under 10 feet of winter snow. The woman standing on the porch had kept 5 children alive through the starving moon. She had dragged a frozen man back from the edge of death. Hannah turned smoothly, wiping her wet hands on her apron, and stepped into the dim interior of the cabin. Pike laughed. "Looks like your woman's got sense, Ridge, going to pack her bags." 10 seconds later, Hannah stepped back out into the sunlight. The heavy oiled barrel of Amos's Henry repeating rifle rested firmly in her hands. She didn't hold it like a frightened amateur. She held it tucked hard against her shoulder, her cheek pressed to the stock, her eye tracking straight down the iron sights. "Put the gun down," Hannah commanded. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a whip crack. Pike glanced up, his sneer faltering. The two hired guns froze. A woman with a gun was a joke in town. A woman with a rifle standing on her own porch, looking entirely willing to pull the trigger, was a different calculation. Now, widow. Pike warned, his gun still trained on Amos. You put that iron away before you hurt yourself. Hannah didn't blink. She shifted her aim 3 inches to the left, squeezed the trigger, and racked the lever in less than a second. The gun roared. The heavy point, .44 caliber slug tore through the brim of Pike's hat, ripping it off his head and sending it spinning into the mud. The horse screamed and reared, throwing Pike off balance. Before the ringing in their ears stopped, Hannah had the rifle leveled dead at the center of Pike's chest. The hammer was back. The next one goes through your lung. Hannah said, her voice dead calm. Drop it. Gunsmoke hung heavy in the damp spring air, a sharp, bitter smell cutting through the scent of wet pine. Pike sat frozen in the saddle. His horse stamped its hooves nervously in the deep mud, sensing the spike of raw adrenaline. Hannah did not lower the rifle. The iron sights remained locked, dead on Pike's sternum. Amos moved. He didn't rush. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps through the muck, closing the 10 yards between the woodpile and the horses. Pike's hired guns kept their hands strictly away from their belts, their eyes darting between the massive mountain man approaching them and the woman with the smoking Henry. Amos reached Pike's horse. He reached up, grabbed the barrel of Pike's drawn revolver, and twisted it sharply backward. The hammer bit into the webbing of Pike's thumb. Pike yelped, his grip failing, and the gun tumbled into Amos's massive hand. Amos didn't say a word. He cracked the cylinder, dumped the cartridges into the mud, and threw the empty revolver into the rushing creek 50 yards away. He repeated the process with the other 2 men, disarming them with a terrifying, methodical efficiency. Turn them around. Amos finally grunted, stepping back. Pike spat blood from a bitten lip. His eyes burned with a venomous, humiliated fury. Cobb ain't gonna let this go, Ridge. You know he ain't. Tell Cobb he sends men up this mountain again. I won't shoot the hats off them. Hannah called out from the porch. Her voice was steady, carrying an absolute certainty that chilled the blood. I'll bury them under the woodpile. Now ride. Pike glared at her, then yanked his reins hard. The 3 men spurred their exhausted horses back down the treacherous, muddy trail, their coats snapping in the wind. Amos stood in the yard watching until they disappeared around the lower bend. He listened until the sound of the hooves faded completely into the roar of the runoff. Only then did he turn back to the cabin. Hannah had lowered the rifle. The barrel rested against the wooden floorboards of the porch. She was staring at her own hands. They were shaking violently. The iron resolve that had held her steady was fracturing, leaving behind the terrifying realization of what she had just done. She had fired a gun at a man. Amos walked up the steps. He didn't take the rifle from her. He stopped in front of her, his broad chest blocking the sun, casting a long shadow over her trembling frame. He reached out. His hands were rough, covered in calluses and scars, the knuckles permanently swollen from years of hard labor. He wrapped his massive hands over hers, covering her white knuckles where she gripped the gun stock. His grip was warm and incredibly solid. You did good, Amos said softly. Hannah looked up. Her brown eyes were wide, brimming with tears she refused to let fall. She searched his face for anger or shock, but found only a profound, grounding respect. I almost killed him, she whispered. You saved us. Amos corrected. He gently pried the rifle from her fingers. I had them all. I would have swung. I would have died. You saved us. He set the rifle inside the door. When he turned back, Hannah stepped forward and buried her face against his canvas coat. She didn't cry aloud. Her shoulders just heaved as the last of the winter's tension broke. Amos stood entirely still for a moment, unaccustomed to the weight of another human being seeking comfort from him. Then slowly he raised his arms and wrapped them around her, anchoring her in the aftermath of the storm. Spring blossomed into a brief, brilliant summer. The dynamics of the cabin fundamentally shifted. They were no longer captives of the cold, bound by a grim survival pact. They were building a life. Amos spent his mornings checking a shortened trapline, bringing back beaver pelts and fresh game. But his afternoons were spent differently. He began carving. He took down a massive, straight-grained cedar and spent weeks shaping it with an adze and a draw knife. He didn't tell Hannah what he was making. Hannah found a patch of level ground near the creek that received full afternoon sun. She cleared the rocks, turning the dark, loamy soil with a rusted spade she found in the shed. From the depths of her burlap sack, she produced a small, canvas-wrapped bundle she had guarded with her life seeds. Turnips, potatoes, and hardy bush beans. She planted them with Mary and the twins, turning the labor into a game. One evening in late June, as the sky turned the color of bruised plums, Amos hauled his finished cedar project onto the porch. It was a cradle. The wood was sanded smooth, the joints tight, and pegged without a single iron nail. He had lined the bottom with the softest, thickest rabbit pelts he had collected. He set it down near the wash basin where Hannah was wringing out shirts. She stopped. The soapy water dripped from her raw hands as she stared at the cradle. It was a piece of craftsmanship born of pure, unspoken affection. For the boy. Amos grunted, looking out toward the tree line, suddenly finding the pines fascinating. He's getting too big for the basket. Hannah walked over to the cradle. She ran her fingers along the smooth, curved hood. She walked over to Amos, stood on her tiptoes, and pressed a kiss against his scarred, bearded cheek. "Thank you, Amos," she murmured. It was the first time she had touched him purely out of tenderness. The mountain man closed his eyes, the roar of the creek fading to a dull hum, replaced entirely by the warmth of her breath against his skin. August brought a dry, baking heat that turned the valley floor into an anvil. The cabin's supplies were dwindling again. They had meat, and Hannah's garden was yielding modest roots, but they lacked necessities. They needed salt, coffee, heavy canvas for winter coats and boots for the children. They needed a milk cow if Seth was to grow strong. Amos still had a handful of gold eagles stashed beneath a loose floorboard. It was time to go down. The journey to Bitter Creek took 2 days. It was a stark contrast to their brutal ascent. They walked with purpose. Amos led the grey mule, its panniers loaded with cured beaver pelts to trade. Hannah walked beside him, her head held high. The children, tanned and robust from the mountain sun, bounded ahead on the trail, chasing grasshoppers. They hit the edge of town just past noon. Bitter Creek hadn't changed. It was still a dusty, violent scar on the prairie, smelling of raw timber and spilled liquor. But the people walking the boardwalk stopped and stared as the family came down the main thoroughfare. The whispers started immediately. Everyone recognized the giant in the buckskin coat, but the woman walking beside him drew the most attention. They remembered the starving, hollow-eyed widow on the auction block. The woman striding through the dust now was different. Her spine was steel. She wore a dress she had meticulously tailored from Amos's extra canvas tarps, tough and practical. A heavy hunting knife hung casually at her hip. She possessed a terrifying, quiet dignity that commanded space. Amos tied the mule to the hitching post outside Jenkins Mercantile. As they stepped onto the wooden planks, the batwing doors of the saloon next door swung open. Hiram Cobb stepped out onto the boardwalk, followed by 2 fresh enforcers. Pike was nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it he had kept riding south after losing his hat to a woman. Cobb stopped. The greasy smile faded from his face, replaced by a calculating glare. He looked at Amos. Then his eyes slid to Hannah. "Well, well," Cobb said loudly, ensuring the gathering crowd in the street could hear. "Looks like the mountain man finally brought my property back." The street went dead silent. Men stopped loading wagons. Women pulled their skirts back and stepped into doorways. Amos's hand drifted toward the Henry rifle slung over his shoulder, but before he could touch the leather strap, Hannah placed a firm hand flat against his chest. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes locked on Cobb. She stepped past Amos, walking right to the edge of Cobb's personal space. "I am nobody's property," Hannah stated. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried the weight of the mountain they had just descended. "You sold a debt, Mr. Cobb. The debt was paid in full." "There's interest, widow." Cobb sneered, though he took a half step back from the intensity in her eyes. "You owe me for the trouble. Your men came to collect that trouble in April." Hannah replied smoothly. "One of them left without his hat. Do you want to see if you can leave with your head?" A low murmur rippled through the crowd. The rumor of Pike's humiliation had floated down the mountain, but nobody had believed it. Looking at the cold, hard set of Hannah's jaw, they believed it now. Cobb's face flushed an ugly shade of crimson. He opened his mouth to order his men forward to assert his dominance in his town. Hannah reached into a leather pouch at her belt. She pulled out a heavy, solid gold eagle. She flipped it through the air. The coin flashed in the harsh afternoon sun and landed in the dirt at Cobb's feet with a dull thud. "There's your interest," Hannah said, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "For the dust we're kicking up in your town. Don't ever speak to me or my family again." She turned her back on him. It was the ultimate insult. She didn't consider him a threat worth watching. She walked past Amos, pulling open the door to the mercantile. Amos stared at Cobb for a long, heavy second. A slow, dark grin spread across his scarred face. He nodded once to the saloon keeper, then followed his wife inside. Cobb stood on the boardwalk, his face burning, staring at the gold coin in the dirt. His enforcers didn't move to pick it up. The crowd watched him, the fear he had cultivated for years suddenly evaporating in the dry heat. A woman had just publicly broken his absolute power, and she hadn't even drawn a blade to do it. Inside the store, Jenkins stammered behind the counter, quickly pulling bolts of canvas and sacks of salt. Hannah negotiated the prices, trading the beaver pelts with a shrewd, uncompromising logic. Amos stood by the window, watching the street. The children were looking at jars of peppermint sticks. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a silver dime, and tossed it to Jenkins. "Give them the candy," Amos said. He looked at Hannah. She was inspecting the stitching on a pair of leather boots for Mary. She was fierce, brilliant, and entirely whole. He had bought a mother of 5 out of pity, expecting to dig graves in the snow. Instead, she had rebuilt him, defended his home, and just brought a corrupt town to its knees. Hannah caught him staring. She offered a small, private smile that never reached the crowds outside. She walked over, slipping her hand into his. "We need to look at the milk cows at the livery," she said softly. "Then we go home." "Yes, ma'am," Amos rumbled, squeezing her hand. They loaded the mule and walked back up the trail towards the timberline. They left Bitter Creek behind forever, not as refugees fleeing a storm, but as the absolute masters of their own frontier. They had shaken the West not with bullets, but with an unbreakable will to survive. Autumn bled into the high country like a slow-moving fire. Aspen leaves turned a blinding metallic gold, shivering in the crisp crosswinds that warned of another winter. This time, however, the changing of the seasons carried no scent of desperation. It only brought the satisfaction of preparation. Getting a pregnant Jersey cow up the steep rutted trail had taken 3 grueling days. Amos ended up carrying the beast's front weight over the worst of the scree, bracing his boots into the loose rock, while Hannah guided the halter. They named the cow Maud. She now occupied a sturdy lean-to Amos had built against the southern wall of the cabin, her low, rhythmic chewing providing a steady baseline to the homestead's daily noises. Survival had transitioned into living. Mary, now 8, handled the Henry rifle with a terrifying, blank-faced competence. Amos had cut down the stock of a salvaged Winchester for her, teaching her to shoot off a dead rest. She didn't flinch at the recoil. She was Hannah's daughter through and through, possessing a quiet, observant nature that noticed when the wind shifted or when the mule's ears pinned back. Levi and Jacob spent their days dragging dry timber from the deadfall, their small bodies growing thick and corded with muscle. They were mountain boys now. The hollow, haunted look they wore in Bitter Creek was entirely gone, replaced by the sunburned, dirt-smudged arrogance of children who knew every hiding spot in a 3-mile radius. Seth, no longer a fragile infant, burning with fever, pulled himself up on the edge of his cedar cradle, his thick legs testing their weight. Amos watched all of this from the chopping block. He rested his hands on the handle of his splitting maul, a familiar posture, but the man inside the heavy canvas coat had fundamentally changed. For 40 years he had operated under a singular solitary philosophy: a man only had to carry his own weight. He had viewed attachments as liabilities. He had viewed the world down in the valley as a trap waiting to spring. Hannah had sprung the trap, but she hadn't caged him. She had anchored him. Late one October evening, the temperature plummeted enough to warrant a heavy fire. The children were asleep, stacked beneath thick buffalo robes, their breathing a synchronized, peaceful rhythm. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, rendered tallow, and the sharp tang of drying sage hanging from the rafters. Hannah sat at the heavy plank table working a needle through a tough piece of oiled leather. She was making winter moccasins for the twins, pushing an iron awl through the hide with practiced rhythmic force. Amos walked over from the stove. He didn't sit in his usual chair opposite her. He pulled up a wooden stool and sat directly beside her. Hannah paused her work. She looked at him, her brown eyes catching the orange flicker of the firelight. The lines around her mouth had softened over the summer. The brutal edge of constant vigilance had dulled, revealing a face that was strikingly deeply handsome. Amos reached into the pocket of his vest. His massive, scarred hand emerged, holding a small, dull circle of metal. He set it gently on the leather hide in front of her. Hannah set down her awl. She picked up the circle. It was heavy. It was a silver dollar, but the face of Liberty and the eagle had been entirely hammered out. The edges were smoothed, folded inward, and polished until the metal gleamed with a dull, practical shine. It wasn't a jeweler's ring. It was a mountain man's ring forged on an anvil with a ball-peen hammer and infinite patience. "I ain't a man of words, Hannah," Amos said. His voice was a low rumble, barely louder than the crackling pine knots in the stove. "I don't know the proper things to say, and we ain't got a preacher within 400 miles. Hannah traced the smooth silver with her thumb. She didn't look up. Her breathing hitched a tiny, sudden intake of air. "I bought a debt down in that town." Amos continued, his eyes fixed on her hands. "Reckon that was the best money I ever spent. But I don't want you here 'cause of a ledger. I don't want you working off a price. I want you here because this is your home, because these are your mountains, and because—" He swallowed the words, feeling foreign and heavy in his throat. "Because you're my family." Hannah slowly lifted her head. A single tear escaped the corner of her eye, cutting a clean track down her cheek, but she wasn't crying from sorrow. The sheer, overwhelming weight of his earnestness hit her squarely in the chest. This man who had fought blizzards and greedy men without batting an eye was currently terrified of her answer. She picked up the ring. She held it out to him. Amos hesitated, then took it between his thick thumb and forefinger. Hannah extended her left hand. Her fingers were scarred, the knuckles rough from lye soap and hard earth. They were the hands of a survivor. "Put it on," she whispered. Amos slid the heavy silver band over her ring finger. It fit perfectly. He didn't let go of her hand. He encompassed it entirely within his own, his grip warm and absolute. "I don't need a preacher, Amos Ridge." Hannah said, her voice fiercely steady. "I need a partner. I need a man who stands his ground when the wolves come to the door. You proved your vows in the snow. You proved them in the mud." She leaned forward, closing the space between them. She pressed her forehead against his, a gesture of profound, unspoken trust. Amos closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of her hair, feeling the solid, living warmth of her against him. Outside, the wind began to howl, sweeping down from the glaciers, threatening another brutal, isolating winter. But inside the cabin, the cold simply didn't matter. The debt of Bitter Creek was buried, forever replaced by a bond forged in ice iron and a heavy silver ring. They were ready for the snow. The Wild West was never conquered by men with fast guns or politicians in suits. It was broken and tamed by the quiet, brutal resilience of people like Amos and Hannah. People who understood that survival isn't just about outlasting the cold. It's about finding something worth staying warm for. From a $300 auction block to an unbreakable dynasty in the high timber, their story is a testament to the grit of the human spirit. If you felt the chill of the mountain and the fire of their resolve, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more untamed stories of the frontier.